Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. 4:30 in the afternoon is a very bad time in Mysuru. It's a nap time for most people. Anyway, now the session that we have here is, you can see, it's about non-fiction. I have one fiction writer here, Nikhil Alva, who has written his first book on If I Had to Be a Soldier. This is fiction based upon contemporary history. At the backdrop of Mizo National Front, the Mizo Insurgency, led by Pulal Denga, and the entire, the battle between the Assam Rifles and the Mizo insurgents forms the backdrop for a love story. I will let him do the talking about his book, but before that, I would like to introduce Ambassador Srinivasan, Krishnan Srinivasan, who was our foreign secretary, who retired in 1996, and very distinguished and elderly gentleman, far more senior to me in service. So he has written a book called, this is the non-fiction book I picked up, because the title said non-fiction, so I picked up his book, Old Europe and New Asia. But his passion has been, for quite a while now, fiction writing. He has written quite a few novels which center around a Somali diplomat in Delhi who acts as a private detective. About that, I will let him talk on that book himself. So what I'll do is, I will start with Nikhil, if you don't mind, sir. And then we can go on to Ambassador. Here I must mention that after talking about the fiction, I would definitely like to talk about the non-fiction aspect, which is about the foreign policy issues, which he has raised in his book, Europe and Asia, on which he has plenty of expertise and lived experience as a diplomat in so many countries. So there we will talk about contemporary foreign policy issues, the new international order, and how India is responding, or how Asia is responding, all that. So first I would like to talk with Nikhil. Please explain to the audience as to what made you write about this Mizo Insurgency as the theme of your novel.
Thank you, Ravi, for the opportunity. Everywhere I go talking about my novel, I get asked, why are you writing about Mizoram? Have you lived in Mizoram? Are you Mizo? And the truth is, no, I haven't lived in Mizoram. I'm not Mizo. I have traveled extensively in the Northeast. But my career as a media professional is that fundamentally I'm a documentary filmmaker with over 25 years of making documentaries, making other kinds of movies. And I'm always looking for a great story to tell. And in this story, in the story of Mizoram and what happened over there, I found a story that really moved me, and moved me enough to want to tell that story. And the medium I chose was that of a novel. So the novel is called If I Have to Be a Soldier. It is set against real historical events. So I think in that sense, we have a little bit of leeway with the title of this session, because the historical events in this novel against which the fictional characters are set are all real and actually took place. So why Mizoram? Why this story? When I was reading and looking through ideas about over a decade and a half ago, I stumbled upon this story of a species of bamboo in the Mizo Hills that flowers once every 50 years, right? And when this bamboo flowers, what happens is that the rats come out of the jungle, and the rats basically eat the protein-rich seeds of the flowers of the bamboo, and the numbers explode exponentially, right? And then from there, the rats actually go in to eat, in the paddy and invade the villages, and there's a famine. A famine actually takes place. So from the sprouting, from the flowering of the bamboo, there's a massive famine that takes place. And this is what happened in Mizoram in 1959. It's called the Motam, right? The process of this. And because of the way it was mishandled by the government at that time, thousands of people actually died in the Mizo hills of starvation. And this led to a feeling of great anger and of wanting, an independent nation, saying, India doesn't care for us, we've been left to die. We want our own nation, we want independence. Which 7 years later becomes the launch of this massive insurgency in 1966 that went on for 20 long years, in which thousands of people died, right? And in 86, the peace accord was finally signed. And today, Mizoram has transformed into an oasis of peace, one of the most peaceful states in India, by all parameters, one of the most progressive, whether it is childcare, whether it is women's rights, you look at any parameter, Mizoram is amongst the top states in India today, an oasis of peace. So I found this story really powerful. I found the causality between the flowering of the bamboo and an insurgency in which thousands of people die really powerful. And the way I chose to tell that story is with fictional characters, but set against these real world, real historical events.
Thank you, Nikhil. Now, let me turn to Ambassador. Ambassador Krishnan, you have been a lifelong career diplomat, and you have handled policy making at the highest level, especially foreign policy. Now, what made you come to fiction writing after such an exciting career as a diplomat and in foreign policy making?
Well, thank you very much, Ravi. I'd like to just start, if you don't mind, by thanking Shubha for this very kind invitation to be here. And I'd also like to say what a pleasure it is to be in Mysuru, the home of R.K. Narayan. And it's a great privilege for me to be at this festival. Now, to answer your question, well, I haven't actually given up writing nonfiction in the sense that this book, Power, Legitimacy, and World Order, came out this year. But I agree that I do find writing nonfiction now much, much more difficult than writing fiction. It requires much more research. It requires footnotes, which are a real burden for any nonfiction writer. And I think that I'm more content now to write matters of the imagination rather than political history, quite apart from the fact that I'm now several decades distant from foreign policy, in fact. So my books are really quite theoretical. In terms of this book, Power, Legitimacy, and World Order, Ravi, I think that these are the three ingredients that have been in global affairs right from the beginning of time. Power is really the definition of hierarchy in the world today. Power can be nuclear, conventional, non-conventional, smart power, soft power, you name it, but all have a basis on the basis of hard power. That without hard power, it's very difficult for. Indeed, indeed. So this constitutes really the pecking order for the world. In terms of, but power without legitimacy is rather empty. So what is legitimacy? Legitimacy is a compact between the governed and the governing. And when that compact collapses, then power becomes quite meaningless. In a way, power and legitimacy are very closely allied. That's why you have even dictators, autocrats, let's say North Korea, let's say China, who look for legitimacy outside their borders in order to give themselves credibility. And world order, if I could just touch on that, world order today is not the same as world order 1945. It's not the same world order as 1918, and certainly not the same order as 1648, when the nation state really came into being. So what is world order? World order is a set of principles which are supposed to govern relations between nations. But these principles have been laid down by a small group of countries. And the institutions like the United Nations, which were supposed to be the final arbiter, particularly the Security Council, of these principles have really proved to be disappointing because institutions like the financial institutions of the World Security Council are not inclusive. And this is the argument that countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt, etc., have used that we need to change these institutions in order to make them inclusive and to give newly emerging powers much greater say. So that is what my non-fiction book refers to.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, turning back to Nikhil. Nikhil, I would like to know, since you wrote the book, when did you publish this book?
It launched earlier this year, the Jaipur.
Oh, this year?
Yeah.
Okay, you have been to Mizoram recently.
Yes.
And now, when you wrote the book, I mean, the backdrop is the insurgency.
Yeah.
And of course, you also mentioned that it has been one of the most peaceful states in the Northeast. Now, going back to the period of insurgency, you rightly mentioned there that Mizoram was the only state in India which was bombed by the Indian Air Force. And the people of Mizoram have not forgotten that. And they cannot understand why India did this. I mean, of course, the insurgency was also extremely violent, and hundreds of, or maybe thousands of Assam Rifles soldiers died, and civilians died. And I remember an IAS officer was kidnapped from Lungle. And his the central focus is in a town called Lungle, which is about 200 kilometers south of Aizawl. So, because I have served in Mizoram, I'm quite familiar with the entire terrain and the people. So, I must also mention here that between 1966 and 1986, the Mizo Insurgency spread. And then the peace accord happened. Can you tell us about how the peace accord happened and what were the, agreements or terms of agreement?
Sure. Just touching on that, briefly. Essentially, the 1986 peace accord was signed after Rajiv Gandhi took over as Prime Minister. It was one of the first major accords that got done. The Mizos had been fighting for an independent nation. The accord gave them finally an independent state, but within the territory of India, and obviously the powers that come with the state of determining self-determination and electing your CM, etc., etc. It also provided general amnesty for all the insurgents who laid down their arms and surrendered their arms to come back into the political mainstream, which they did. They all came back from camps across the border. And the first election that happened, it was actually a Congress government in Mizoram at that time. The CM stepped down for elections, and Mr. Laldenga, who was the leader of the Mizo National Front, got elected as the chief minister. Strangely, within a year, his own party rebelled against him and threw him out of power. And he died a few years later of cancer in the UK. But democracy got its roots very firmly in place in Mizoram, and you've seen some amazing instances of it, including recently with a new Mizo government in the state elections, a brand new party that came up and swept the elections, right? And it's absolutely peaceful. I was in Mizoram recently, about a month ago, and we drove, Lungli to Aizawl in the night. There's no fear. There is no fear of insurgents or the gun or things that used to be there in the 80s and before the accord.
Yeah,
so
actually,
it's quite a powerful accord which stood the test of time.
Yeah, the hold of the Indian Union has always been very fragile on Northeast, and. It was Jawaharlal Nehru's foreign policy at that time, domestic policy, to let the northeastern tribes be as they are. To maintain their cultural diversity and to keep them away as they are, without bringing heavy footprint of Indian Union onto those states. And this led also to a feeling of isolation, alienation, and rebellion when they were not taken care of. So, but now I'm very happy to hear that Mizoram has come out as a new political party, which is almost modeled on AAP, which is unheard of in the Northeast. In the Northeast, there have been either Congress or BJP, and both the parties have very, very fragile hold on those people. I mean, the same politician will join BJP or Congress depending upon whichever party is likely to win. So it's very very surprisingly good thing to hear that Mizoram is now coming out with a completely unique model of political development. In this context, we are seeing what happened in Manipur about which started about a year ago. And it's almost like a civil war between the Kukis, Zomis, and Manipuri Metis. Unfortunately, or fortunately, something like that has not happened in Mizoram. The tribals themselves have not fought, which is what's happening in Manipur. It's a tribal war. But what I'm trying to bring about is that the Northeast is a very unique, it presents a very unique picture of tribal society which is not fully incorporated into our mainstream. And it has remained outside. Naga insurgency continues off and on. And the Naga political dialogue goes on for the last 20 years. So it's a very uneven situation. But anyway, the fascinating thing about the book is the story between three characters who are all schoolmates. Sammy, who is a Naga, and Sammy is a mixed tribe, Mara. And Sena is a Naga, Mizo, and this girl called Martha. So it is their love story, and one joins the Indian army, Sammy joins the Indian army, Sena becomes a Naga Mizo rebel, and this Indian army chap is in love with Martha, who is the sister of this Mizo rebel. So it's a very fascinating story woven around these three characters. So I would recommend strongly that you read the book, not only for its fiction, but also for its background. So now, if I can turn to Ambassador. So would you like to tell us more about the Somalian diplomat who is a private detective?
Sure. But I'd like to also say I've read Nikhil's book, and I really strongly recommend it as a work of fiction. It doesn't really matter so much about the historical background. I think as a work of fiction, it stands on its own, and it's a very attractive story. But on my fictional, I've written 7 or 8 books now in the same series, which I call the Michael Marco series. This is about a Somali, retired Somali ambassador. His name is Michael Marco, and you may ask why an African's called that name. He was born in Italian Somaliland and Catholic, and this is why he has that name. He's a very prominent diplomat from Somalia, retired. He fell out with his government, was sacked, and then he went from to various countries, the United Nations, as a private individual, then Britain, India, and elsewhere. And in India, finally, because I travel much less than I used to, he comes to Calcutta in search of the African community that existed or still exists in India. And he is a person who's sedentary, who's thoughtful, who's very well read, very religious, and he meets up with an Indian private detective, a very young lady, with a prosthetic arm because she's been shot when she was in the police in the arm, and very energetic and active, and they work together to solve both political problems and criminal difficulties, criminal problems. So this is why Michael Marco is a thread through the series of novels I've written, and this is the short background. He's waiting, of course, to go back to Somaliland, but he can't because his passport has expired. There's no government to give him a new passport, and he can't in any case go back to Somalia, which is full, as you know, of the Islamic State militants. So he wants to go to Somaliland, which is the old British Somaliland, which is still relatively peaceful and autonomous. But he's waiting to go back, and I hope I'll be able to take him back one day.
You know, I have worked in a country very close to Somalia, that is Kenya. I was there for 4 years. And I used to see Somalian refugees there, and I had even, there was an ambassador, I think one of the European countries, probably Italian ambassador, who organized a book reading by a Somalian author in his house. That was my first exposure to a Somalian author. Very fascinating. Anyway, sir, Nikhil, would you take us to the period, when Mizo Insurgency finished? Did it have any impact upon the neighboring states? For instance, Naka insurgency still continues. Is it likely to have any positive impact upon them?
Look, I think the root cause for insurgency in a lot of the Northeast is fundamentally ridiculously bad domestic policies, right? Let's take a look at Mizoram. What is the root of the problem? Root of the problem is that independence, the country it was a new country, we had a lot of problems. The Northeast was just forgotten about, right? We can say, tribal identity and giving them space, etc. But the Mizo Hills, for example, was amalgamated into the largest state of Assam, right? They were forced to learn Assamese as the official language. So the manner in which they were treated, they felt alienated, they felt disconnected, socially, culturally. Nobody really in New Delhi gave a damn about what was going on, right? Which eventually led, when the famine happened and thousands died, it was like the tipping point of a lot of resentment and anger that had been building up for a long period of time. And Mizoram, it is not unique. The problem in Mizoram wasn't unique. The same issues, I think, in Nagaland, in many other parts of the Northeast, which fundamentally people have turned a blind eye to, and then years pass, then someone picks up the gun, there's violence, and then suddenly they get our attention, and then we turn, to try and solve the problem. For example, Mizoram, it took 20 years, right? But that peace accord could have happened within 5 or 10 years. What did we give them finally? We just gave them their own state within the borders of India. That would not have been a very difficult thing to have done, should not have taken 20 years to get to that point, frankly. Could have saved thousands of lives. So just to complete that point, I feel similarly in Manipur, there's been brewing tension, brewing, anger, right, for a long period of time, and nobody has actually sat down to listen with an open mind, right? Nobody has actually tried to resolve these issues in terms of whether it is the power dynamic, whether it is distribution of resources. Nobody has really sat down till this whole thing has exploded. Even today, we are still not able to sit down with the different parties and try and resolve and find, common ground. And I think that is the tragedy of the Northeast, for me personally, as someone who's been writing about the area.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, if you go back to that period when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister, he was in a hurry to sign up so many peace accords. He signed the Ulfa Accord, peace accord in Assam. He signed the Mizo Accord in Mizoram. He signed the Punjab peace accord in Longowal with Longowal. Sri Lanka, it's not part of India. So, not yet.
I meant the part of the accords that he signed.
Sri Lanka was a total disaster. I mean, I know that story very well, and he became a victim of that, sending the IPK first and then all that. So what I'm trying to say is Mizo Accord is one accord which Rajiv Gandhi signed, which is holding on.
That's right.
Unlike what negotiations are going on with the Nagas, I know my colleague from IB, Ravi, was involved with the negotiations for nearly 15 years. Then now he's the governor of Tamil Nadu. But it is left as it is. There is absolutely no sign of a peace accord being signed with the Nagas. Probably because the Nagas' demands are much worse than what the Mizos are demanding. Nagas are actually demanding a separate flag, separate identity, separate nation state, which no country can accept.
No, but that's not different from what happened in Mizoram. Mizoram had their own constitution, their own flag. They had a full-fledged army based on the Indian army. And a lot of people, historians argue it wasn't an insurgency, it was actually a civil war, right? They declared independence and hoisted their flag, and they had their own constitution as well. So resolution requires a certain mindset, right? Resolution requires a certain understanding of what at the foundation, what is the basis of the anger or the resentment. If you don't address those issues and you try to, superficially arrive at an agreement, it won't work in the long term.
Actually, I remember what Delhi does often is that they throw money at them. Yeah. There's a Northeast Development Council for which hundreds of crores are given away every year. And when I was in Mizoram, I remember that the central government used to give something like 250 crores or something like that, the budgetary support. And the center used to ask Mizoram to collect 2 crores from their side. And they could not do it. They said, we can't do it. Because no Mizo or no person, no tribal is taxed. They don't pay any tax. And how can the state raise a revenue? And the IAS officers from the scheduled tribes go back to their states and stop paying tax. But if a scheduled tribe IAS officer is in Karnataka cadre, he pays tax. So this is a problem. And most of us don't even know this. And so revenue generation within the state is not happening. So it's completely dependent upon Delhi. And they treat all of us as wise. You know that word, why? Of course, yeah. We are all foreigners. And when I go on a posting there, they ask me, do you get salary from Mizoram state or Delhi? I said, we all get salary from Delhi. Anyway, so that is an aside. So,
I'm sorry, having said, because you were posted there in the 90s, I think, right? In the early 90s.
90 to 92.
Yeah, I think a lot has changed, certainly over the last 30 years in Mizoram. Especially because I think the growing Indian economy has created a lot of opportunities and options. A lot of the Mizos are in jobs all across India, right? There is a lot of, so the thinking and the feeling of isolation, I think, has reduced considerably, right? And also because of education opportunities. When I was in Mizoram last month, I went to schools and colleges with my book, talking to kids in school and in colleges, and I was struck by one or two things that came back at me. The first is that nobody in Mizoram really wants to talk about these 20 years, right? The children were asking. The children said that our parents don't want to talk about. They don't tell us about what happened, right? It is like a mass social scarring that has taken place, that people just don't want to talk about and want to forget. So young children are asking what happened. Through your book, we're actually discovering what happened. Our parents don't want to talk about it. And the second thing that struck me is a young boy, he must have been about 13 or 14, he got up and said, I've heard all this about what happened. Can you tell me how I can love my nation? Can you tell me why and how I should love my nation? Right? As a feeling of, when you talk about separation and things. So I found that such a powerful question to ask someone, how can I love my nation? Right?
Is it said in a way that how can I love this nation? Right?
No, it's like, help me understand how I can love my nation, because I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't feel like I'm a part of this nation. Right?
Correct. I understand that alienation. Yeah, that's true. So if I can turn to Ambassador.
Very similar to what the Manipur MP said in Parliament the other day, if you don't mind my saying so. Yes.
So, Ambassador, I would like to raise with you some crucial questions that come up in your book. I would like to talk about 4 themes. One is Islam in Europe. That I'm sure most people would be interested in Islam in general. And Islam in Europe, you have made some very insightful and very perceptive analysis of that. How in mid-1950s, there's hardly any Muslim population in Europe. But in 2010 or 2016, when he wrote the book, there are 40 million Muslims in Europe. Today, I just checked the Google before I came here. In 2013 census, there is 44 million Muslims in Europe. So it is a major problem in countries like France, Germany, and even in England, of course. So how is Europe coping with this problem?
Okay, nice, easy question to start with, of course. But anyway, it's a part, Ravi, of the immigration problem. It's not really quite entirely separate from that. There is a problem now in the developed world of immigration, not only in Europe, but in the USA also. It's going to be a lively election issue. And it's an election issue everywhere in Western Europe as well. After without, we can go into this and take the rest of the day, but let's, just to summarize very briefly, at the end of the Second World War, as you know, Europe was extremely short of people who work, and they encouraged immigration, and they encouraged immigration primarily from colonies, and whether it was Britain or France or anywhere else. And this resulted, as far as the French were concerned, in very large numbers of North Africans coming to Europe. In Britain, it resulted in large numbers of Africans and West Indians coming to Britain, and of course South Asians a little bit later. And I think in Europe, because of the North African influx, and later, much later, the instability in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, in Iraq, you had immigrants into Europe from countries which were predominantly Muslim. Now, it led to Islamophobia, but it also led to a phobia of immigration generally. And the Islamophobia took place because it was conceived that the Islamic immigrants took longer or refused to integrate with the local population. Whether that is true or not is a question of subjectivity. As you mentioned Germany, the German influx, of course, was caused by 1 million Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans being allowed to come to Germany at the end or towards the end of the Syrian civil war. So there was this large number of Muslims, which you mentioned. The problem of identification, assimilation, call it whatever you like, integration. The type of separate development, if you like, of immigrants and the local communities. The amount of welfare funds which were going to the immigrants was another touchstone. And of course, similar debates in USA. And I think the result is pretty well insoluble, because I think the receiving countries have to come to terms with the immigrants, because the immigrants are needed. And they're needed in the USA and they're needed in Europe, because they are doing jobs that indigenous people do not want to do anymore. So I think this is a question of adjustment, but at the moment it's a political flashpoint.
I agree with you, sir, but there's another thing. The extreme swing to the right in most of the liberal democracies of the West is also possibly because of a part of, this is a major problem, you know, migrants coming and taking the jobs of the locals, and also a foreign religion coming and not accepting the multicultural life of Europe, which is not assimilating itself in the European traditions. Europe, which has always been liberal and secular, and which has already given up its religion long back, it is not able to accept a group of people who are fundamentalists in their belief. And
yes,
who are demanding,
that's absolutely
there's
true.
a group which is demanding Sharia in UK.
Well, that is true. I think that in a way, this is the cause and effect problem. The right wing, which is in the ascendancy in Europe, not so much in Britain, but in Europe certainly, is due to two factors. One is the anti-immigrant, anti-Islam, the kind of welfare funds being paid to immigrants. That is one factor. A second factor is the religious factor, if you wish. The countries are no longer Christian as such in developed countries, but they have a Christian ethos and the Christian background. So that is another. But the third and also important point is the anti-globalization factor. Now, these countries feel that the globalization process, which started more or less in 1990 and continued apace, has left the lower classes, the deprived indigent classes in the developed countries, even poorer, and left out of the progress that the rest of society has enjoyed.
Yeah, actually, what you say about anti-globalization is a major factor for the rise of Trump in America, because the globalization was seen as leading to the pauperization of the local laborers. And that is why they voted heavily in favor of Trump, who was saying that make America great again and clamp down tariffs on Chinese imports and all that. So that is one more factor. Now, Nikhil, if you don't mind, I'll continue this. One very important subject I would like to take is
Nikhil could perfectly easily answer these questions.
No, you please jump in. One more subject of interest is in the new political order, the rise of China and vis-a-vis the not so decline, I would not use the word decline, or inefficacy of America in the world, as seen in its failure in Afghanistan, its failure in Syria, its failure in the Israel-Palestine conflict. America is no longer the global policeman, and Russia is not capable, and China is reluctant. So what happens? What kind of an international order are we seeing?
Well, the whole question of international order is a phrase that can be challenged or can be questioned anyway. So can we leave that aside? What we've got at the moment is a world where there are competing ideologies and competing economies, and this competition is basically between what one might vaguely call the West, difficult to define, and the East, also difficult to define. But in this fluctuating world, you have two real themes. And these themes are related to the desire for imposing on the rest of the world a certain worldview which is opposed strongly by the other party. Now, in terms of the United States, as you mentioned, if you can say decline, you can say maybe sharing world responsibilities, which would be perhaps more accurate. It is a country that is very sensitive to the fact that the Chinese have, as you mentioned, extended their reach into many continents where they were invisible before. That is to say, in Latin America and Africa and in the West Asian region. And you could also say that the Americans are very conscious that the Chinese have no history of colonialism, I mean classic colonialism, and they have a manufacturing capability which is second to none in the world, whereas American manufacture is going down, European manufacture similarly, and they find it very difficult to sustain this competition from China. And lastly, I think the United States and Europe are very conscious of the fact that China has enormous resources of investable funds. So if a country wants to have a highway, if it wants to have a bridge, if it wants to have a presidential palace or whatever, if you go to China, they do have the money available. And they have the manpower, of course, but leave the manpower aside. They have the funds. The United States will go through, or the World Bank or whatever, will go through enormous amount of, fact-checking and assessment of capability of repayment, etc., etc. Now, countries like India may say you are falling into a debt trap, but these countries are doing it with their eyes open because they need immediate money, and they're not too worried about the third generation paying the money back.
Nikhil, I want to ask you a question different from Mizoram. You know, it's such a fascinating book. Have you thought of making it into a film?
Indeed, I have. In fact, I first, I'm a filmmaker.
Oh, yes.
So before I've been working on the screenplay, and I think there are a lot of platforms that want to see this as a film, and hopefully in a year that should happen.
Yeah, when I read the book, I thought that this is an ideal film story. I mean, it can be easily made into a film. And you are likely to produce it?
No. I'm a writer in this context, and I'd like to limit myself.
You may have to change the scenario a little bit. Too many people are dying in that book.
You're giving the story away.
Well,
but yes.
Yeah, too many people actually died, sir. It was a bad period. It was a bad period in India. So we have 5 minutes now. Okay, Ambassador, one last question. Now, talking about the decline.
I was an ambassador a very long time ago.
Okay, I can't call you Srinivasan.
I'm Mr. Ordinary now. Anyway.
Sir, now let me talk about India in the foreign policy context. You know, we just spoke about the rule-based international order. That has been the term used by Western democracies whenever they want to punish Russia or China. Yeah. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov once questioned, whose rules, whose order? That is exactly the question. And Jaishankar has also done it very often in his talks, talking about Russia, Ukraine, and why India is not condemning Russia, and in that context. Now, looking at these two difficult flashpoints in the world today, Ukraine, Russia, and Palestine, Israel, do you agree with the position that India is broadly taking, or do you suggest that it should have been different, and how so?
Okay, very briefly then. Again, I'm not necessarily 100% votary of the government's foreign policy, but in this particular respect, I'd say they have walked very successfully over eggshells. I think the question can be boiled down to this. Every country, every big country certainly, has a certain area which they consider sensitive to their national security. In the United States, as you know, Ravi, they have the Monroe Doctrine, which really means that no country can come into the entire hemisphere. So hence the jitters about Cuba, etc. So they will get very alarmed whether there's a foreign presence from Newfoundland down to Peru. So in the case of India, we feel the same way in South Asia. As you know, we are very concerned about Chinese ingress into various parts of South Asia. So every big country has this, let's say, this perimeter which they'd like to protect. The same with the Russians. The Russians, since the time of the Second World War, have always felt vulnerable to pressure from the West. Not from the East, not from the South, but from the West. And the West has translated itself into NATO, as you know, which one of its main objectives was to counteract any influence and advance from Russia, then Soviet Union, now Russia. And Ukraine was a particularly sensitive point for the Russians, for the Soviet Union first, then for the Russians. They had numerous assurances from the West, from NATO, that NATO would not advance to India, to Russia's borders on the West. Those promises were broken. Those promises were never in writing, so it was easy to deny. And they've advanced to the point where the Ukraine situation became fundamental to Russia's interests. I think I don't need to say more than that, because I think Russia felt that it had to take some measures. Now, you remember that there was an agreement in April of 2022, 2 years ago, which, if it had gone through, would have perhaps settled this problem. The Minsk agreement would have settled the problem. I'm sorry to be a bit technical here, but the Minsk agreements were rejected by the West. The agreement of 22 was rejected by the West. So I think what we're moving towards is some kind of a cordon sanitaire, some kind of, which the Russians will feel content with, and then the fighting will stop. However, it'll probably be a difficult border, like many divided borders that you have in the world today. It'll probably be like that, but it will be satisfactory to Russian security interests.
I fully agree with you. In fact, one last sentence on this subject, that what America is trying to do in Russia, to Russia now, is what exactly they did to Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They're using Ukraine to bomb Russia. And Afghanistan broke Soviet Union, and they're hoping that Ukraine will break Russia, which is being extremely optimistic, and I don't think it'll happen. So on that note, I would like to take some questions. Yes, a couple of questions.
This anti-immigration, do you think these people from the Islamic countries are making it more difficult for themselves by taking a very aggressive posture, like the Charlie Hebdo, the murder and the Paris bombings and other things? Instead of forming a parliamentary process and following the rules of the country in terms of if they have to raise any protest, they're getting involved in all these mass, massacres and all that. So is that, they're shooting themselves in the leg by getting involved in all these blasts and other violence act. Would I be right in saying this?
Did you get his question?
Okay.
Was there a question? You spoke about Charlie Hebdo.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but what is the question, sir?
The question is that why is there an anti-immigration wave in Europe? That's because maybe the Islamic people who are migrating into the country, they are not being seen as very non-violent. They're being seen as violent. They're being seen as getting involved in mass massacres and other things. There's a perception that they are violent by nature. Is that what is contributing to the anti-immigration wave in Europe?
Thank you very much, Balaji. I think that, unfortunately, Charlie Hebdo has many aspects. It's like a polygon. You can look at it from many different points of view. I'm not necessarily sympathetic to the African point of view or the European point of view on Charlie Hebdo. I think there are limits to heresy. Yeah, well, I don't want to say freedom of expression. I'll say there are limits to heresy. You know, when in India you can put Hussein into self-exile, you know, then you understand the sentiments which are aroused by heretical or allegedly heretical attitudes. Now, I think Charlie Hebdo printed cartoons, as you know, I think you know much better than I do, of the Holy Prophet, which were absolute anathema to certain countries. There was a reaction, I agree. I don't necessarily think it was immigrant-related, because after all, Salman Rushdie had a fatwa against him from Iran. It was not related to India. So I don't think we should minimize it into a immigrant problem. I think it was a heretical problem, and I must say I have some sympathy with those who feel aggrieved.
Just to add one sentence to what Ambassador said. I know France has got very strong rules against those who are against anti-Semitism. And that is a religious issue. If you can take a stand on that issue, why can't you take a stand against this? You know, Muslims have a very strong feeling against blasphemy. That's different. You know, they cannot try to impose that. They can impose it in Saudi Arabia. They can't impose it in France. I agree with you. But these Western democracies also have certain limits which you can't cross. But those limits apply only to their favorite idols.
If you compare Islamic immigration into Europe to South American immigration to North America, where North America also wants people to work there, and there is no religious angle there. So they have assimilated much better.
That's part of the globalization problem which you mentioned. You know, you import cheap labor, and they become a problem for you because you know you need them because they don't pay social security. You don't have to guarantee their wages. And
no, my point is the immigrants are not creating any problem.
Well, yes, not on this kind of.
Yeah, where is the problem from North America, Honduras, or Mexican immigrants?
The immigration is a problem.
No, Americans want the immigration because they want workers.
But Trump wanted to build a wall.
No, that is just political. I think the industrialists will not allow him. They want immigration.
May I humbly tell you that there are 2 more sessions. Can we please close and have an excellent conversation outside? It's been wonderful listening to you all. And however fascinating the topic is, we are out of time. Thank you so much for coming and being part of our Mysuru Literature Festival.